Subscribe strategically. Jacek Bartosiak talks to 𝗻𝗎 about the future of Europe and transatlantic relations. Strategy and Future.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And today is my favorite guest, one of the best European geopoliticians, if not the best. My personal preference is that Velina is the best and the best to talk to, Velina Tchakarova. Hi, Velina. How are you?
Hello, Jacek. It's great to be back on your show. This is a big honor for me, and it's always a pleasure to actually talk to you about geopolitics and to convey some of my ideas to the Polish audience. So it's a big pleasure on my side.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And the audience should know that when we meet abroad at conferences, we tend to talk off record for hours, sometimes ignoring even the panels. That's how we interact frequently, and in my case at least, almost lovingly in terms of intellectual input that I received from Velina. So I hope our conversation will also be refreshing in a way that, to the extent that we are recording this on the 19th of February, 2025, and this is I risk to say it, I wonder what you think about it, a pivotal moment in the history, and for sure in the history of Europe. We are right after the Munich conference that was held on security, right in the middle or right after the Riyadh talks between US and Russia, amidst a major rift or a major brawl even between the, or fought at least, between the Europeans and the US and their perspectives. And on top of that, and maybe that does not reach the ears of Western audience, Western Europe especially, that in Poland also it creates confusing opinions, confusing feelings as to, you know, what's going on in the world. So let's start first with the identification of things that are happening and your assessment of those. And then I would very much like to encourage you to navigate towards the future. So let's try to predict the future, what's going to happen. This is the most important now. The things are accelerating, developments are accelerating, and I'm really honestly wondering, because I haven't talked to you in 2 months, even off privately, and I don't know what you have in your head now, how the things will evolve. So the floor is yours, Velina. Let's get started.
Thank you, Jacek. It's very important to identify the problems, to be very honest and actually brutally honest about what's going on. And I think that you mentioned a keyword that is emotions. I think that Europeans are just too emotional right now. When I say Europeans, I mean European decision makers. So I will start with, first and foremost, short wrap up what I think is going on. Let's say the momentum of what's going on, and in a second step we can also discuss what we think is happening next. You named it, I call it make it or break it moment for Europe. We have discussed this in your previous podcasts, that this full-scale war Russia has been waging on Ukraine is not just about the imperial ambitions and goals of Moscow, but as I've been outlining, since 2021, prior to the beginning of the full-scale war in 2022, this has been also a move, indeed all-in move, high risk, let's say the highest risk at all, on behalf of Putin to secure the pole position between United States and China in this emerging systemic rivalry on behalf of Moscow. And we now may agree that Putin has miscalculated on many things throughout these 3 years. But on one thing he did not miscalculate, and that is obviously his strategic vision, where he wanted to see Russia being, namely Russia no longer being the systemic player on par with the United States and China, at least to get this pole position, to become this wild card in this newly shaped relationship, so that neither the United States nor China would be able and willing to ignore Russia's interests in the future. And this is where we have arrived now 3 years later. I think that the Europeans are just not admitting to this reality. They are not admitting to the reality of a Cold War 2.0 between America and the Dragon Bear. What is the Dragon Bear? This is not a strategic alliance. It's not a military pact. It's not an entente the way we understand these complex relationships in the Western mindset and in the Western framework of strategic thinking. But because these are two natural rivals that have invested into creating this modus operandi for more than 10 years, so that this modus operandi is now working in all systemically relevant domains. And I mean, of course, modus operandi of strategic coordination between China and Russia. So this is the first reality that the Europeans do not admit. The second, they do not admit that, Russia has started a non-kinetic warfare against the European Security Order on the 24th of February 2022. They have done anything about it. The third important point is, of course, that if you have a wrong diagnosis of reality, of realpolitik in 21st century, of the strategic goals of the key three players, China, Russia, and United States, then obviously you have also a very vague, if at all, strategic vision of yourself and where you want to be in this picture. And the last week was, for me personally, the proof of that. This kindergarten reaction, this being outraged, all these emotions, how dare the Americans leaving us alone, how dare they actually now siding with the Russians and propagating Russian narratives. So, it's a complete kind of surrender to reality. And that is that what happened in Riyadh, the first, let's say, round of talks between United States and Russia, it wasn't even about Ukraine first and foremost. It was a relaunch of strategic conversation, strategic dialogue between America and Russia, finding a way to create some sort of new modus operandi between America and Russia. Here, the simplified version would be an inverse Nixon-Kissinger approach to Russia, something similar to what happened in the 70s with, luring China away from the Soviet Union, right? This is the simplified version. But we can discuss in the next round that there are more complex issues that need to be addressed, just that, because for the obvious reason that Nixon-Kissinger approach being applied to Russia is not going to work out this time. For the simple truth that I already explained, namely, if you have invested already 10 plus years into building up this relationship between Moscow and Beijing, you're not going to throw it under the bus, the first time when the Americans reach out to you. You're going to instrumentalize it. You're going to weaponize it. In the first, I think, round, you might try to negotiate better energy prices because suddenly it's about energy collaboration between the Americans and the Russians. Guess where? In the Arctic. And in the Arctic, as we've heard already from Trump, is going to be the next big theater of this new great game, the great game of 21st century. So again, given the background of the failed negotiations between the Russians and the Chinese over the Power of Siberia 2, Power of Siberia 1 is already running, but they have been facing issues to negotiate good price for Power of Siberia 2, you see that even if you have a modus operandi, you're still a rival, you're still competitor trying to get the best out of the situation for yourself. And all of these are things that are not being discussed in the European capitals, or let's say, I mean, not to speak in Brussels.
And why is that so? Just could you expand on that, elaborate? Why is that so? Things seem to be apparent, evident. So why is that so?
Well, my simple explanation for that is that we've sort of come up with a kind of infantilized view of the world.
Political class. Yeah.
Yes.
Some claim, and I kind of share this opinion, that Europe over the last 35 years, and some claim that even longer, became a kind of a place of complacency. Energy, they were dependent on energy from outside sources, be it from US, Russia, or Middle East, and military defense from United States, at the same time enjoying globalization, which means that the Europeans were not adults, and the European Union was not an adult in the room. And now the kind of maturing comes. So maybe the entire political class of people, united by this shared ideas of solidarity, prosperity, values, simply have they have no this toolbox of instruments of geopolitics. They completely have no idea how to survive in the jungle called the world, and it's in its default setting that had been with us since 500 for the last 5,000 years, actually, and then for the reason of United States holding this equilibrium on their own shoulders over the last 35 years in primacy, in primacy posture, they didn't feel the weight. I mean, the Europeans didn't feel the weight of make decisions on their own, so to speak. How would you react to that?
Yes, that's the one side of the coin, and next to it, there is still this sad reality that even now, 3 years later, in the context of the most devastating, by all means, the most devastating war taking place on the old continent since the end of the Second World War, and I mean not only in humanitarian terms, in conventional warfare terms, I mean the geoeconomic impact on Europe, the loss of credibility, the very fact that, as I was saying, even at the beginning, so the first day when the war started, I said that this is the day when the whole narrative on strategic autonomy has died. And it's also the day, when practically, as I said, this Cold War 2.0 officially has manifested itself, because Russia would have never, ever dared to launch a full-scale war on Ukraine if it had not relied on the comprehensive long-term oriented support coming from China in advance. But then again, of course, there is this sad reality that still 3 years with, amid ongoing war, France, Paris, Berlin, Brussels, they don't feel a direct threat coming from Moscow. So there is no direct sense of urgency that something needs to be done. And in the end, even if, let's assume the worst case scenario, going beyond the frozen conflict, because now we are moving towards the frozen conflict scenario for Ukraine, with the devastating, with devastating territorial concessions, political concessions, because suddenly, as we saw from yesterday's narratives coming from Washington, from Moscow, we've known these narratives. Zelensky suddenly became inconvenient as a political figure, and now both Moscow and Washington want to remove him for different reasons. I mean, from Trump's perspective, it's personal, but from Moscow's perspective, you cannot negotiate, with the political figure who has been the figure of, freedom fighting and so on and so forth. So even if we assume that we go beyond the worst case scenario of a frozen conflict, meaning ongoing war in a time frame of 2028, 2030, 2032, you see, still there is no sense of urgency in Western capitals, Western European capitals.
Yeah. Velina, let me, of course, challenge you on a few things, okay, so that we have a lively discussion. How would you react to my suggestion that maybe the United States, though, have outplayed their hand a bit? Since, if they don't want to provide security guarantees to Ukraine or the European troops, if they are, relaxing the Article 5 ironclad commitment, as was suggested between the lines by the Secretary of Defense, if objectively we know that they need to pivot away finally to the Western Pacific, that we have this, US-China thing, so maybe it's a sign of weakness. It's a sign of weakness of the United States that they decided to finally change the posture towards Russia. This is one thing. And in fact, that they cannot influence behavior of the Europeans if the Europeans decide to act against United States. I wonder what you think about it. And the second question is, all in all, it may be so that Ukrainians cannot be compelled by the United States to cease fire. And all in all, as I heard voices from Ukraine, and I was there in Kiev and elsewhere in January, the American help is not that of much principal importance anymore to Ukrainian effort. I don't know. Nobody knows. Actually, as you see, the Zelensky and Trump's exchanged salvos of how much the US helped Ukraine. Nobody knows, actually. And maybe it's so that United States cannot leverage Ukrainians to make a deal. And in this theater, it will turn out that the United States is toothless, loses face, because simply cannot influence events on the ground. What do you think? How would you react to all those challenges?
Okay, these are two very complex questions. First, being linked to the analysis as to whether the United States has outplayed its cards in Russia/Ukraine, and whether this is a signal of weakness, if I understood that correctly.
Yes.
And I would, from a strategic point of view, and let's say if I were to consult the government at that time, because let me be very open and clear, the previous administration, US administration, has had by far the worst foreign policy NSA team ever. Ever. The Blinken-Sullivan team has been the worst and has left a disastrous portfolio and a disastrous performance, not only as, concretely with a focus on Ukraine or with a focus on the relationship with Russia, but in general. But this is my assessment. So here, it's one thing to assess the foreign policy performance of a specific administration. It's another thing to derive from it weakness or strength. Because if I were to consult the administration at the time when the war started, I would have recommended to the United States exactly that, to make sure that Russia is as weakened as possible. But let's be very clear that there has never been a goal of a US administration over the period of the last 30 years, including the last one, and certainly this one, to make sure that Russia dissolved itself.
Yeah, we know, we understand.
So if we are measuring the strategic goal from a US perspective, weakening Russia and making sure that this is as long as possible of a war has been implemented. The American goal in this war to support Ukraine, but just as much as needed, just as enough as needed, but not as much as needed, so that Ukraine would be enabled to, let's say, bring about significant change in the military operations, because we don't know for a fact how this war would have, turned out differently. We know that Ukraine has been struggling throughout the 3 years to receive what was promised, and that is certainly the American approach. The American approach in this war succeeded. And I wouldn't diagnose this as a weak hand. If I look at the geoeconomic and the geopolitical portfolio of the United States right now, 3 years after, this war, I mean, obviously the Americans are better off in, let's say, in the collective West as compared to the Europeans.
I agree that given the weak hand economically that the United States entered the systemic war, in my opinion, 2018 with a trade war initiated by Trump, the United States strategic thinking has improved the position that would simply result from the the economic forces and the structural forces by exactly sequencing strategy, holding at bay the Russian effort in Ukraine, elsewhere. But let me recapitulate my question again in terms of the weak hand, so that maybe to try to drive the issue down to the essence. What if the United States exaggerates in simply subduing Europeans? Because what's happening is subduing Europeans. Simply the security architecture is being discussed out of Europe by Russians and Americans, basically. This is a very strong lesson. If I were in Paris and I was Macron, I would never forget it and I would change everything. Me, yeah. This is number one. What if the United States adds the tariffs, the sanctions on trade, on cars, and stuff that Trump is kind of suggesting or promising to deliver? Don't you think that the United States may overdo, and then the Europeans will start the trade negotiations with the Chinese, and the Chinese will be simply creating a new Eurasian trade zone and security, and provide kind of security, holding the Russians at bay, and the America will lose the systemic war if they overdo things. What do you think about that?
Yes, I'm getting this question very often in the last weeks about the way how the Europeans would shift towards China as a reaction to this quite assertive and very aggressive American politics, not only related to the tariffs, but also imposing, the whole security architecture, the way how the Americans want it. And here, I think that, what I think, in normative terms, and what I assume and anticipate might happen are two different things. So I suppose that you want me to answer the question in terms of my anticipation, not in terms of my normative thinking as a European. Whether I like it or not, it won't change the whole picture. Whether I'm outraged, whether I'm angry about it,
I'm not talking about
it won't change.
Or your convictions. Okay. I'm talking about.
So exactly. So we don't need to discuss the very fact that Europeans turned from being dependent on Russian commodities, Chinese markets, and American security umbrella, to being dependent on American commodities, American access to American markets, and American security umbrella. This is the reality, 2025. This is the reality we are talking about, because our European companies are right now shifting towards the US because they have better conditions, they have better prices. We are dependent on American LNG, and if tomorrow Trump says, I'm going to impose going beyond the tariffs policy, if he threatens us that he's no longer going to send us the LNG, guess where we are going to get the LNG from? It's going to be Russia.
Yes, exactly. And
guess
maybe
which pipelines we are going to open? Be the pipelines.
Yeah, Velina. But Mahbubani today in the Foreign Affairs suggested that this is the only viable way forward for Europeans.
So here the question is, and this is the leading question, were the Americans who pushed us into this position, or was it the lack of action and the lack of strategic vision, and actually the lack of geostrategy in general, that brought us into this misery? And I would go for the second. I would go for the second, and I will explain why. Because even if you look at what happened from the last week, now suddenly the Americans are coming up with a completely new plan involving talking to the Russians, involving with the Russians, negotiating with the Russians. And it turns out that we don't have any plan. That starting in 2025, 3 years in a war, we have to suddenly summon decision makers and trying to come up with something. This is not adequate reaction. And this is what I meant when I said there is no lack of sense of, there is no sense of urgency. There is a lack of adequate perception of reality, adequate reading of reality. Now, I would argue, and I would go for the thesis, that most of what is happening in Europe, on the old continent, is self-inflicted pain.
Yeah, of course.
Why is that? Because if we say tomorrow we are in a dire crisis, we can actually exploit and explore own fossil fuels, even on the old continent. We would go to every corner of the world, and we will actually negotiate with every small, medium or big size supplier. If we say we are having a security problem, we will have launched the fabrics 3 years ago. We will have launched partial war economy, at least along the eastern flank of NATO, because this is where it's the cheapest, and the closest to Ukraine location, and it's the cheapest way to produce. Western Balkan countries, which are candidate countries to join the European Union, South Eastern European countries. Then you have, Central Eastern European countries. Did we do that? Were the Americans who prevented us from doing that?
Yeah, but no, but let's not, kind of, but let's not dwell upon the past and the past mistakes. Although I claim to think that the Americans manipulated a little bit of the public in Europe, trying to divert our attention away from things. They did it under Biden, and under Trump, they will try to divide European countries as well.
I agree, and I think it's not going to be even division, it's going to be bifurcation. There will be 2 blocks with those countries in Europe that will still go along with the United States because of the security guarantees, and then those who don't have an urgent and immediate need to guarantee their security, as I explained, and they would go away from the United States at least for the next 3-4 years. So bifurcation of Europe. So as above, so below. Because there is a bifurcation of the global order, which also gives you an answer to the question whether the Europeans will further oscillate between United States and China by actually getting closer to China. And here I have
bad news. What will they do? What will they do?
I have bad news, because China is currently, looking inwards and trying to come up with its own strategy, how to cope with this new world, with a bifurcated world, with a world in which trade wars and complete irreversible disruption of supply chains, of technological networks, of semiconductor networks, all of these networks that are critically important, is here to stay. So, of course, we might argue, yes, that will be a common denominator for trade between China and Europe. But I would argue that China will go and reach out to the global South and try to actually forge much more predictable partnerships with countries in Asia, with countries in Africa. In Africa, meanwhile, you have all, without exception, all 54 African countries having China as partner number 1, and then reaching out to Latin America, which is the reason why Trump, started hyperventilating from the first week because of Panama Canal, but also because of Colombia and so on.
So what will the Europeans do? What do you think?
So the Europeans, first and foremost, they will have summit after summit. They will have declaration after declaration. They have now declared 700 billion out of thin air for we don't know exactly what, apparently to support Ukraine. I would argue that the problem here is not even leadership, or it's not even the lack of strategic vision. It's really the incapacity, the intellectual, if you like, the stamina, the lack of stamina, because you have to be a certain sort of personality, going beyond your own shadow, going beyond the power politics of your party, which is mostly the case in our European states right now. Everything is party politics, everything is ideology, and it's going to get worse. Because if you are in a context, and this is my working hypothesis, and this has nothing to do with the war, because this has been the case prior to the war. If you are in a context of, let's say, 10 to 15 years structural and systemic crisis in Europe in general, there is no simple answer to that. Is it going to be equally dispersed? Absolutely no. Absolutely not. So as it is going to get worse, we are going to have oases and hubs of economic growth, of optimism, if you wish, technological progress, and a lot of, let's say, business activity. And my working case here is that because of this Iron Curtain now emerging, with Russia succeeding in, let's say, kind of building up this union with Belarus and with the parts of Ukraine, for the time being, even if we assume that there's going to be a ceasefire and we will kind of have a break, right? I mean, the European economies will be able to take a break from this inflationary impact from the war. There will be a strong push, and this is my optimism for you, to create the missing infrastructure from north to south. That means from the Nordic countries that are now part of NATO, from Central Eastern European countries, as well as Southeastern Europe up to Turkey, which is the absolute inevitable, and most important hub, geo-economic and geopolitical, in the old transatlantic infrastructure, and connecting to the new world, so to say, West Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Eastern Africa. So practically, this infrastructure on behalf of Europe is completely lacking because it has been neglected over the last 70 years, right? So this has to be created. It has dual use. We talk about digital connectivity. We talk about energy corridors that we don't have. And we will mostly rely on LNG in the future as a transitionary, energy source on the way of, greening our economies. We will build nuclear power plants. We will need to move the military equipment, the military technology. We will need to build, fabrics for the ammunition and so on and so on, because our reserves are completely depleted, right? And all of this actually has a positive impact on business activities, on companies, on startups, and on specifically on the old, let's say, Soviet bloc, the former Soviet, bloc republics, or let's say the new Europe. And I think that there's going to be an inevitable realization on behalf of Brussels, as well as on behalf of other partners like Japan, South Korea, and even the Americans. They will not actually, there won't be a full withdrawal, as some are saying, from the, by the United States, from the old continent. That's not going to happen like that. I think that it's going to be more bilateral, more, topics oriented. So you have energy, you have technology, you have big tech, you have military, you have cyber, and all of these issues. And there will be public-private, military, civilian initiatives that are going to emerge out of this. And I think that this is the good message, the positive message I have for you in all this misery and in all this kind of precarious situation. I have zero expectation when it comes to the current political leadership in our European capitals and in our European institutions. Zero. So that means that either suddenly we will come up with a new leadership, really new mindset of people, But I don't mean this kind of populist forces on the right and on the left, which are now closing the circle. And, you know, history repeats itself 100 years later. So you have these new fascist and these new communist, new Marxist forces thinking and trying to convince us that they have the answers, whereas they're just you know, capitalizing on the mood, on the general mood in Europe. So I think of really new mindset of leadership, because in every crisis there is, you know, a breaking point in which there is this kind of sudden U-turn in terms of personal leadership, but also in terms of kind of statecraft.
Thanks, Velina. How would you react? How would you answer to this question about Ukraine, whether the Ukrainians will put up a fight against the imposition by the United States? What do you think about it?
Yes, I had a conversation even this morning with a Ukrainian journalist, and you know, being based in Kiev, and he confirmed exactly this, that you know, Ukrainians will not just surrender, and will not, you know, surrender without a fight. So my anticipation, again, it's not about my personal feelings, my personal emotions here. My anticipation is that first and foremost, Trump is going to try to get rid of Zelensky. It's a personal vendetta. He took it personally because of the whole impeachment process he got into, and he blamed it on Zelensky. Remember? So this is very personal, and we know for a fact how Trump acts in such situations. But let's assume, even if we have the scenario of Zelensky becoming the next leader, right? Because whom would you think would be the, let's say, the most realistic figure right now? I could not come up with any other name.
It's not about name, it's more about the forces. I think that the only viable option to replace Zelensky is the group of people that kind of matured during the war, being security forces, security apparatus, new magnates of independent Ukraine, new warfare production facility owners that surround Zelensky, and those are the people. And that poses a risk for the United States, because those guys will not want to give up Ukraine, because they put their blood and treasure into it. This is a new elite of Ukraine, and you know, it's not one figure that could be replaced simply. I think it's not going to be such an easy thing to swallow by the United States, you know, manipulating. Plus, they have a tough army now. They have the tough army. They have the UAV drone industry. You know, they and Biden sent them a lot of equipment right prior to his end of the term. So I'm not sure that the Ukrainians are going to fold like that.
I think that Ukraine would be folded. It's not a matter of will, right? It's really about what they have at disposal for the moment, how much they have, what's the real, you know, what's the real, because we get a lot of different voices from the country. Also, a ceasefire is just that. Remember how many ceasefires have been agreed on and have been violated during 2014 and 2022? How many?
Yeah.
Countless. So from Ukrainian perspective, ceasefire is still kind of new status quo, but nothing final.
They without security architecture in place that satisfies them, they will not believe in anything.
But for the moment, from realpolitik perspective right now, the only security guarantee I could consider, I would render important and relevant, next to NATO membership, will be the acquisition of nuclear weapons. I just don't see any other situation, any other scenario for Ukraine in which the security, the territorial integrity of this country would be guaranteed. The statehood of Ukraine would be guaranteed. The existence of Ukraine on the map would be guaranteed by any other countries, be it through bilateral or multilateral deals.
There are two models, but they are hardly feasible, that could that this could occur. One is the invitation of Chinese to make a big trade deal with Europe and securing the borders of Ukraine. So China as a guarantor of the arrangement, just like the United States became a guarantor of arrangement of the Peace of Portsmouth between Russia and Japan at the beginning of the 20th century. And this is exactly the moment, this was exactly the moment when the United States entered the world arena as a geopolitical player out of their hemisphere. So maybe this is
but this again plays into the Russian cards because China has been propagating its 12 points peace plan right from the beginning, reflecting completely the Russian
and the Ukrainians will give up the territories that are occupied by the Russians.
Yes, but then again,
they will keep their independence.
If this is your starting point, of course, for the moment, we might argue that there is going to be some sort of North Korea, South Korea peace resolution without peace deal.
Yes, Ukrainians will accept it.
And then we have Chinese or Indian or both and other global South peace, stabilization force along the demarcation line. And then, of course, the narrative is this could hold similarly to what happened with South Korea, North Korea. But then my question is it really going to hold? Because look what North Korea is doing currently, given the transfer of technology from Russia following the military pact.
But the only reason why this would hold would be keeping the globalization intact between Europe and China. So it will be in China's interest to keep it intact and safe.
But then your assumption is also that China never wanted the decoupling. And this is a wrong assumption because there are meanwhile enough evidence, there is enough evidence and there are enough proofs that actually come to show that China, since Xi Jinping came to power, has been going for the decoupling, for the systemic decoupling with the United States.
With the United States, but not with Europe. And that's a whole point because this weak Europe is still a pivot. If Europe joins the United States in decoupling from China, China will lose the systemic war. If Europe decides not to join the United States will lose the systemic war. Even this weak Europe, it's a really...
But something, the way you present it, something has to give because you are in the position where you can, at some point of time in the future, you cannot take the best from both worlds. Right now, there is one geopolitical player being in the position to take the best from both worlds. And it's being tolerated by both blocs.
That's true.
And that's India. So now if you assume that we are going to arrange a geoeconomic global order with China while being the security partner of the United States, that's not going to work. Why? And I will explain why very shortly.
Hold on, Velina. That's why Bruno Machado suggested yesterday on Twitter that it's time for strategic autonomy of Europe once and for good, because without it, with half measures, it will not happen. But the United States will kill the European economy. And although I'm against it, especially I'm Polish, I'm challenging you on that because, I think that in terms of logic, it holds some water, in it.
Again, let me differentiate between my normative thinking. Of course, I'm also European and I want strategic autonomy. But then again, my job is to tell you what is the most likely thing to happen. And I'm telling you that we are even much more far away from strategic autonomy than we were.
Yes, you're right.
3 years ago. Yeah. And this is not the American fault, by the way. It's mostly self-inflicted.
Right. You're right. Also, Paul, also the thing that I will tell now proves your point as regards Poland. Because the second model for Ukraine would be to create intermarium in conventional forces, strong enough with Poland, Ukraine, maybe Sweden, that conventionally could deter Russian forces. But Poland refused to modernize the forces and prepare for that. Also for the same damn reason that you outlined for the European leaders, because those guys here in Warsaw believed in the for too long in the U.S. Primacy and security umbrella, and no moves on our own, so to speak, and modernization not on our own terms. That's why we didn't create the intermarium properly with the Ukrainians, and now we have no capabilities to do it. And we can see that the United States may not be interested in creating one anymore, because that would actually remove the U.S. leverage in Europe in a way against Russia. So this is a new reality. And Poland found itself in a very tricky position. As you notice, Poland decided not to send troops to Ukraine during this Paris conversation. You know why? Because it's less about this historic past with Ukraine. It's more about our understanding that if the United States doesn't provide guarantees, the guarantees don't exist. So we don't want to be vulnerable.
As I explained, because security guarantees under the current circumstances are not credible, no matter if they are coming from Berlin or UK or France. No matter, either you have NATO or you have nukes. And these are the two options, or as you rightfully pointed out, you have a bigger defense alliance. It could be a regional defense alliance, credible enough, ideally with a nuclear umbrella. And I think that one of the main trends in this bifurcation of the global system, where the middle powers are increasingly faced with this new reality to oscillate, there will be probably more countries acquiring nuclear weapons.
And at Strategy&Future in Warsaw, we believe that despite U.S. reluctance to be present in Europe anymore, and their apparent moving towards offshore balancing posture that you, in other words, described, that the alliances of options, energy here, military here, it's called offshore balancing for our audience. Then that will create a change in the U.S. approach to non-proliferation, because U.S. was vehemently against it since the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But with a new posture, maybe Poland, United States could turn the blind eye, move away the head if we decided to do it, because that would create a good leverage for the United States against the consolidation of European peninsula, and also keeping the Russians at bay. If they are present here and NATO is gone, so to speak, so there is no escalation thing, because United States doesn't guarantee all this thing. So at Strategy&Future, we see this narrow path. But it's so difficult to talk to any politicians about it here. So as you can imagine, in this postmodern vision of the world. But anyway, I also think that among the new administration, there will be people making decisions that would understand what I just said. U.S. administration, and that maybe this is a proposal forward. But of course, the Germans hearing what I just said, sitting in Poland, they would freak out. And French as well, because this is also about distribution of power within the EU and Europe and all other things, and all ghosts and phantoms of the past would reappear across the continent as well, so to speak.
Well, maybe to end up with some positive takeaways. Now, first, positive in a sense that it gives some sort of assurance that things could still, be much worse than they are. First being that there is little to no interest on behalf of the United States, China, or Russia to get engaged in a direct nuclear or conventional confrontation. I think this is very important.
Scalable systemic war,
Exactly. Given the
existence of thermonuclear weapons are giving us a peace chance.
Yes. I think this is important. This is critically important. Even after 3 years of war here on the old continent, the imminent risk of NATO-Russia conflict hasn't become higher. I think this is also important to convey to the
Yeah.
audience, just to give this sense of security, especially now that everybody is hyperventilating, everybody is, just having this doom and gloom kind of analysis. Nothing of that is true. So we have here two geopolitical hard facts.
Yeah.
Yes, there is always an avenue for miscalculation, without a doubt. And maybe this is one of the reasons, as you rightfully pointed out, because of the trend now of nuclear/conventional arms race, it's inevitable to happen. As you increase the insecurity in the direct environment, in this chaotic, volatile, and highly, insecure environment, there is going to be an urge to get more weapons, including, as I said, probably nuclear weapons. But maybe this is one of the more positive messages from Trump, where he openly reached out to Russia and China and proposed to do some sort of trilateral talks on nuclear disarmament. I think we are too early for this stage, but the very fact that he reached out openly and not through closed door channels is a good thing. I would actually assess it as a good thing. Again, when it comes to Europe, I don't want to sound too dramatic, but the situation is really dire in terms of security policy and in terms of, direct strategic outlook. Like I said, for the next 10, 15 years, there is nothing positive to say. Again, all of these problems are indeed reversible. So if there is a political leadership, if there is a strategic vision, we can do things differently. It's not like it's a final outcome. It's not like this is the finite process of what's going on. It's just that I don't see a window of opportunity with this current leadership, with these political leaders and decision makers, and with these institutions on this path right now. I mean, let me give you a very, very concrete example. You don't have to be a mathematician to understand, and our audience is sophisticated enough to understand that in the equation between reviving the competitiveness, which is about trillions of euro, investing in security and defense, which is about trillions of euro, and achieving decarbonization ahead of everyone else, which is about trillions of euro, something's gotta give. Something in this equation is just too much. So my question is, what's gonna give in this? Is it going to be the decarbonization being postponed? Are we going to emphasize competitiveness and reindustrialization? Or are we going to take care finally of our security and defense? And here it's not the Americans, it's not the Chinese, and it's not the Russians to answer these questions.
Yeah.
This is political ideology. This is power politics among the party landscape within our member states, and then going beyond that at the level of institutions. And all of this is solvable. And I will use a cliché from Trump, maybe the only sentence that I liked in his inauguration speech of the golden age: the return of common sense. That is that we also need some sort of common sense, of course, reflecting our European interests, our European needs, and our vision of our place in the world. I would go more in the direction, just to make another proposal, I wouldn't go in the direction of China. I would go in the direction of the winners of the biggest disruption between United States and China. I would go in the direction of countries like Indonesia, like Vietnam, like India. I would go into the direction of African states. I would go into the direction of, Mercosur states from the European perspective. And we'll actually try to geoeconomically diversify, negotiate, seal off deals in as many sectors and domains as possible.
sounds interesting and alluring to the people right towards the end of our podcast. So the revolution of the common sense also in Europe. Thank you, Velina. Our guest today was Velina Tchakarova, sitting in Vienna. I hope you enjoyed, and I look forward to to talking to you again soon. Things are accelerating, so we'll have plenty to talk to and about.
Thank you, Jacek.
Thank
Great
you,
pleasure.
And you stay with us for further podcasts. Thanks.